Hello, and welcome to Democracy in Reverse, Hungary, Turkey, and the Rise of Competitive Authoritarianism. In this narrated comparative politics explainer, I examine how authoritarianism can rise in countries that still hold elections. The focus is on Hungary and Turkey, two countries with different political histories, but similar patterns of democratic backsliding. Hungary was once viewed as a strong example of post-communist democratization in Central and Eastern Europe. Turkey has a different background, shaped by secular nationalism, military intervention, religious politics, and debates over executive power. Yet both cases raise the same larger question: how can elected leaders use democratic institutions to weaken democracy from within? My central argument is that Hungary and Turkey show how authoritarian drift can develop through elections, legal reforms, media pressure, weakened judicial independence, and concentrated executive power. Hungary's path has been more legalistic and party-centered under Viktor Orbán and Fidesz, while Turkey's has been more presidential, coercive, and crisis-driven under Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and the AKP. To make this comparison, I will look at the theoretical framework, historical background, key events, institutions, key figures, and the current state of democracy and authoritarianism in both countries. The central question for this presentation is simple but important. How can authoritarianism rise in countries that still hold elections? Hungary and Turkey both show that authoritarianism does not always begin with a coup or the immediate cancellation of democracy. In both cases, elections continued, opposition parties remained active, and formal institutions still existed. But over time, the conditions of political competition changed. Courts became less independent. Media environments became less free. Electoral rules and state resources increasingly favored the ruling party, and executive power became more concentrated. So my argument is that Hungary and Turkey demonstrate how authoritarianism can grow from within democratic institutions. Hungary's path is more party-centered and legalistic under Viktor Orbán and Fidesz. Turkey's path is more presidential, coercive, and security-driven under Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and the AKP. To understand Hungary and Turkey, I am using Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way's concept of competitive authoritarianism. In competitive authoritarian regimes, formal democratic institutions still exist. Elections are held, opposition parties are allowed to operate, courts, legislatures, and media may still function. But the problem is that incumbents abuse state power so often and so seriously that the system no longer meets basic democratic standards. The opposition may technically be allowed to compete, but it is competing on an uneven playing field. That distinction is important for this comparison. Hungary and Turkey are not cases where elections simply vanished. Instead, the concern is that elections, courts, media, and other institutions increasingly operate in ways that favor the ruling party or leader. So the question is not only, do elections exist? The deeper question is, are those elections meaningfully free and fair? A second framework for this comparison is Larry Diamond's argument about democratic recession. Diamond argues that global democracy entered a period of stagnation and erosion around 2006. This matters because democratic decline does not always look like a sudden collapse. In many cases, democracy weakens gradually. Rights become less secure. Courts become less independent. The media environment becomes less free. Opposition parties can still exist, but they face more obstacles. Hungary and Turkey fit this pattern. Neither country simply canceled elections. Instead, democratic accountability weakened over time. Political power became more concentrated, and institutions that should limit leaders became less able to do so. So the concept of democratic recession helps place Hungary and Turkey within a larger global pattern of democratic backsliding. Hungary and Turkey are useful cases because they are different enough to compare, but similar enough to reveal a shared pattern. Hungary is a member of the European Union and was once viewed as a major success story of post-communist democratization. Its authoritarian drift has occurred mainly through Viktor Orbán Fidesz party dominance, constitutional change, and institutional redesign. Turkey has a different history. It is a NATO member with a long record of military intervention, secular religious tension, and political instability. Under Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and the AKP, Turkey's drift has centered more on presidential centralization, security politics, media pressure, and coercive state power. In both cases, the leaders came to power through elections. The concern is what happened afterward. Democratic accountability weakened from within the system. Hungary's modern democratic story begins in 1989, when it transitioned from communist-re to multi-party democracy. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Hungary was often viewed as one of the stronger post-communist democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. In 2004, Hungary joined the European Union, which seemed to confirm its place among liberal democratic states. The major turning point came in 2010, when Viktor Orbán and Fidesz returned to power with a large parliamentary majority. That majority gave Fidesz the ability to reshape the political system from within. This is what makes Hungary such an important case. Orbán did not take power by canceling elections. He came to power through elections. But after 2010, Fidesz used its parliamentary strength to rewrite constitutional rules, change electoral laws, weaken checks and balances, and increase control over public institutions. Freedom House's 2025 report rates Hungary as partly free and notes that since Orbán and Fidesz took power in 2010, constitutional and legal changes have helped consolidate control over independent institutions. So Hungary represents democratic backsliding through legal and institutional change. The democratic structure remains, but the fairness and independence of that structure have weakened. Turkey's modern political background begins with the founding of the Republic in 1923 under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. The new republic was built around secular nationalism, and over time, the military became an important political actor that saw itself as the guardian of the secular state. Recep Tayyip Erdoğan and the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, came to national power in 2002. Early on, Erdoğan and the AKP were often viewed as reformers, especially because Turkey pursued European Union accession and reduced some military influence over politics. The major turning point came after the failed coup attempt in 2016. The coup attempt was a serious threat to the government, but Erdoğan's response went far beyond those directly involved. The government carried out sweeping purges across the military, judiciary, universities, civil service, media, and civil society. Then, in 2017, Turkey approved a constitutional referendum that changed the country from a parliamentary system to a powerful executive presidency. This concentrated authority in Erdoğan's hands and weakened institutional checks on presidential power. So Turkey's authoritarian drift was more crisis-driven than Hungary's. Hungary's shift happened largely through legal and institutional redesign after a parliamentary supermajority. Turkey's shift accelerated through security politics, purges, constitutional change, and presidential centralization. The key events in Hungary and Turkey show two different paths toward authoritarian drift. In Hungary, the most important turning point was the 2010 Fidesz supermajority. That parliamentary majority allowed Viktor Orbán's government to change the constitution, redesign the electoral system, and reshape institutions from within. A second major development was the consolidation of the media environment. Hungary did not simply eliminate all opposition media, but the information environment became increasingly tilted toward pro-government voices through ownership changes, regulation, and state advertising patterns. The 2022 election also matters because it showed the tension at the heart of competitive authoritarianism. Elections continued, but observers raised concerns about whether the competition was genuinely fair because the playing field favored the ruling party. Turkey's path looked different. The 2013 Gezi Park protests revealed growing public resistance to Erdoğan's governing style and showed the government's willingness to use state pressure against dissent. The failed coup attempt in 2016 was the major turning point. Afterward, the government carried out sweeping purges across the military, judiciary, civil service, universities, media, and civil society. Then, in 2017, the constitutional referendum transformed Turkey's system by creating a powerful executive presidency. So Hungary's path was more legalistic and party-centered, while Turkey's was more crisis-driven and coercive. But both cases show elected leaders weakening democratic accountability while elections continued. Institutions are at the center of this comparison. In both Hungary and Turkey, the issue is not that democratic institutions disappeared. Courts, elections, media systems, and legislatures continued to exist. The concern is that their ability to check power weakened. In Hungary, Fidesz used legal and constitutional redesign to weaken institutional independence. Courts and oversight bodies became less able to constrain the ruling party. The media environment also became more favorable to the government through ownership patterns, state advertising, and pressure on independent journalism. Elections continued, but the playing field increasingly favored Fidesz. Turkey shows a similar pattern, but through a more coercive path. After the 2016 coup attempt, the government carried out sweeping purges, including within the judiciary. Media outlets and journalists faced closures, arrests, prosecutions, and pressure. Elections continued, but opposition figures and parties faced legal obstacles and state pressure. This connects directly to Gandhi and Przeworski's argument that authoritarian institutions are not merely decorative. Formal institutions can be used strategically to manage opposition, concentrate power, and preserve a leader's rule. So in both cases, institutions remained in place, but they became less effective as safeguards for democratic accountability. The key figure in Hungary is Viktor Orbán. Orbán returned to power in 2010 and used Fidesz's parliamentary strength to reshape Hungary's political system. His leadership is often associated with the idea of illiberal democracy, meaning a system that keeps elections but rejects many liberal constraints on majority rule, individual rights, and institutional limits. Orbán also uses a sovereigntist and nationalist political style. He presents himself as defending Hungary from foreign influence, liberal elites, immigration, and European Union criticism. This connects to Axford's discussion of authoritarian populism and sovereigntism, where leaders frame centralized power as a defense of the nation and the people. In Turkey, the key figure is Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Erdoğan and the AKP came to power in the early 2000s, and over time, Erdoğan centralized power around the presidency. After the 2016 coup attempt, his government used security concerns to justify broad purges and greater control over state institutions. Erdoğan also uses populist and nationalist language. Like Erdoğan, he claims democratic legitimacy through elections, while weakening institutional checks on power. The comparison shows that both leaders used electoral success as a foundation for authoritarian drift. Their methods differ, but both cases show how elected leaders can weaken democratic limits while continuing to claim that they represent the people. Freedom House's 2025 ratings help show the current difference between the two cases. Hungary is rated partly free, with a score of 65 out of 100. It receives 24 out of 40 for political rights and 41 out of 60 for civil liberties. This reflects a system where elections and opposition still exist, but democratic safeguards have weakened and the national playing field favors Fidesz. Turkey is rated not free, with a score of 33 out of 100. It receives 17 out of 40 for political rights and 16 out of 60 for civil liberties. Turkey's rating reflects deeper authoritarian consolidation, including centralized presidential power, weakened judicial independence, pressure on media, and legal pressure against opposition figures. So the comparison matters because Hungary and Turkey are not identical. Hungary remains more competitive, while Turkey is more openly authoritarian. But both cases show democratic decline through elected leadership and institutional weakening. The comparison between Hungary and Turkey shows three major lessons. First, elections are not enough to define a country as democratic. Both Hungary and Turkey continue to hold elections, But elections become less democratic when the playing field favors the ruling party, the media environment is tilted, and opposition groups face legal or political pressure. Second, institutions can be repurposed. Courts, media systems, election laws, legislatures, and oversight bodies may continue to exist, but their purpose can shift. Instead of checking power, they may help ruling parties consolidate it. Third, authoritarian drift does not look the same in every country. Hungary's path has been more legalistic and party-centered, while Turkey's has been more coercive and shaped by presidential centralization and security politics. The broader lesson is that democratic institutions matter only when they can still limit power. If those institutions remain on paper but lose independence in practice, democracy can erode from within. The main conclusion from this comparison is that democracy depends on more than elections. Elections matter, but they are not enough by themselves. Democracy also requires fair competition, independent courts, free media, active civil society, and real limits on executive authority. Hungary and Turkey show two different paths of authoritarian drift. Hungary's path has been more legalistic and party-centered, while Turkey's has been more presidential, coercive, and shaped by security politics. But both cases lead to the same broader warning. Democratic institutions only protect democracy when they are strong enough to limit power. When those institutions lose independence, democracy can weaken from within while still appearing democratic on the surface. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching Democracy in Reverse: Hungary, Turkey, and the Rise of Competitive Authoritarianism. This presentation was created for Political Science 657, Comparative Politics, with narration generated using Revoicer and the script, research, and editing completed by Dorea Hardy.